So welcome to the Film Ireland podcast. I'm Gemma Creagh and I'm chatting with documentary filmmaker Anna Rodgers. So Anna has a few works in the mix at the moment, and we're mostly going to be talking about her fantastic documentary piece, When Women Won, and it was about the repeal of the 8th movement and that very interesting referendum. But we've a few other works that we're gonna touch on as well. So thank you so much for chatting with us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
So before we get into your lovely documentary, which I had a good cry over 2 nights ago.
Very emotional. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I just wanted to just get a little bit of background about yourself. Where did you learn your documentary skills and how did you get into the industry?
Well, I went to DIT Ainger Street and I studied communications there. And when I think back about it, like I had a lot of fun and the academic side was very, very strong. But the skills I learned there technically and, in terms of storytelling weren't great, let me say. I'm so glad that we didn't have YouTube then and that our films from that time are not online.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose it was a good grounding in a way, and I made great friends, and it cemented my love of cinema. And I made a documentary when I was in third year in college, and myself and the producer, who was one of the lecturers in the college, David Rain, kind of told a little white lie to RTE and told them I was a graduate, but I was actually still in college. And I went off to America with a camera to make a kind of a video journal of the J1 experience, and it ended up being broadcast on RTE as a 2-part series. When we got home, we edited it and made a little series.
Wow.
Which, is probably completely mortifying to watch back now because I'm in it as well, which I would never do again. But it's a record of a time in my life. And I often think that about documentaries, that they do capture, I suppose, a lot of memories for me, because you end up spending, probably close to a year of your life working on the project. And after that, when I graduated, I was really, really fortunate to meet some people who were kind of key people in my early career. I worked with Dervla Walsh, who is an extraordinary director, who's now gone on to do Handmaid's Tale and Fargo. And Dervla introduced me to Alan Gilsonan. And Alan probably was the biggest influence on my career. I learned so much from him. And I worked with him for 6 or 7 years. We made a lot of documentaries together. And, in terms of like learning how to interview people, really he's been the biggest influence on me, in terms of bringing people back and, getting them to really tell you the story and go back emotionally into that time and recapture it. So I think on When Women Won, I very much was channeling Alan's advice, so even now, even though it's 20 years ago, whatever, I do still, listen to those things that I learned from him, for sure.
It's nice to have just a little bit of mentorship and guidance along the way.
It's so important. It's so important. And I think that, sometimes there are opportunities for people to shadow directors. And, I think if somebody is starting out, that they should grab those opportunities, because you really do learn a lot from that. And it doesn't happen often enough, really, so I think it's a great thing when you get to do it. It's well worth the time. And I know sometimes they're unpaid and you've got to take a bit of a break out of work to do it, but it's well worth doing, for sure. The things you learn from watching somebody who's been doing it for such a long time, you can't learn that on a course. You can't learn it in college,
Yeah, definitely. So to come back then to When Women Won, what did this start life as? Was this something that you were passionate about? Were you brought on board by one of the organizations? Did you pitch it to RTE? How did it take shape initially?
In 2016, we had made a documentary, myself and Hugh Rogers and Savita Halappanavar, the same trio that made When Women Won. We had made a documentary called The Story of Yes about the marriage equality referendum. And Alva Smith, who was part of Together for Yes, one of the co-directors from Together for Yes, would have known me from various things that we would have been involved in over the years. I was on the board of Gaze Film Festival. I would have interviewed Alva at different times. So she approached me initially and we came in to meet together, myself, Alva, Gráinne Griffin, Orla O'Connor, and to talk about how we might make a documentary about what happened during the repeal the 8th referendum. But this was after the fact, obviously, it had come and gone, and we hadn't filmed anything, so we didn't have any archive or anything to tell the story with. And they wanted to make a kind of 15 to 20-minute piece to capture the campaign, to tell the story of how they did it, why they did it, and I suppose why it was important. And it was really to be a kind of a learning tool to show different groups around the world who maybe were looking at Ireland and what had happened here and trying to learn from the campaign. But of course, it's such a huge story and such a good story, such a brilliant story, and they are all such great interviewees. It kind of grew from that. So it was very difficult to tell such a complex story that spanned over 35 years in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So it really evolved, and because the interviews were so strong, and they all felt so passionately about what had happened, I started to see this as being a longer film, and we kind of went from there. But it was commissioned by Together for Yes, so that's kind of unusual in a way. It wasn't commissioned by a broadcaster, or it didn't have any funding from Screen Ireland or anything like that. So it was made on quite a low budget in that sense. And it was very collaborative. The Together for Yes team, the co-directors, would have worked with me on it throughout. And so in that sense, it was very collaborative. And, the footage all came from so many different sources. So it really was a very different experience to other documentaries we would have made before.
And very much so in line with the Together for Yes grassroots campaign itself as well, which, wasn't necessarily this big, huge, well-funded initially from the get-go thing, which is something that is in there in documentary.
Yeah, I suppose it's funny, because the spirit of it, because people cared about the topic, and because of that grassroots piece and the fact that people were very passionate about the topic, we got a lot of goodwill in terms of people being willing to share footage, and that community aspect, of reaching out to all the Together for Yes groups around the country looking for photographs. Did anybody film anything? And does anybody have any, local filmmaker, did they document what happened? So there was months and months of trying to track down footage around the country. And in the end, footage came from all sorts of different places, because people had moved on. And one person sent footage from Iraq even, because they were working over there. Lots of footage came from the ARC group in London. And then there were filmmakers like Paula Geraghty, who, is amazing and is always out there with her camera filming protests and events, and has an incredible archive of footage, who we would have worked together with. And so it really brought together a lot of those filmmakers' pieces that were maybe sitting on a hard drive in a drawer, and just brought them together into this narrative,
And it is such a nice narrative because it has a real reverse swing. So the story of Yes, and it's funny the way it's structured. It's almost like a will they, won't they until it happens, even though we all know, but it really works.
I know, and that's it's a funny thing when you're making a film where we all know the outcome. And lots of documentaries are like that, I suppose. Like, any documentary that's about a sporting event, for example, you know what the outcome is. And so trying to build tension and trying to capture the emotion of that is quite a skill. And Emer O'Cleary edited the documentary with Hugh Rogers as well, who produced it with Zlata. Hugh would have done a lot of editing too. And he had directed The Story of Yes with us, so he knew it's the same kind of structure. You really have to, suspend that feeling of joy throughout, and we would have done that in the interviews too. So everyone wanted to kind of talk in terms of the knowledge that we have now that the outcome was a positive, and we had to try and just rein that in and bring people back and get them to, I suppose, experience those emotions again, and to remember what it was like when they didn't know whether or not they were going to get the yes vote, and to go back into the past too, and talk about when did they first become aware of abortion rights. Was it in school, was it in college, what their own kind of origins were, what drove them, what motivated them to become involved, because lots of us would have known about this topic. But maybe wouldn't have got, physically involved in the campaign. Some of us might have gone out for a protest here and there, but women all came together from different groups, and they would have got so passionately involved and been campaigning for years in some cases. So just trying to find out about them, why did they do that, and get them to tell their own stories too. And in the end, like with interviews like that, you interview someone for maybe 2 hours. You only end up using a few lines here and there.
Yeah.
But in order to get those lines, you really have to go on a journey with them, and you have to talk about the things that would have inspired them, try to get them to tell us, which case was it that motivated them. In some cases, it might have been going back as early as Anne Lovett. For a lot of people, it was what happened to Savita.
Yeah, that definitely was my trigger. Up to that point, it was quite complacent, but I think that was just...
It was a turning point. Yeah, it galvanized a lot of people, and for the younger generation, it really motivated them. So I think, that in the film we did represent that. Sarah Monaghan says, like, you could kind of chart the whole history of the abortion rights campaign in Ireland as pre and post Savita.
Yeah.
And in the film, I suppose we took that as kind of a turning point, and the campaign really started from there. But of course, it's very important to say, like, Together for Yes were only in existence for a matter of months, but there were numerous groups that worked on this for many, many years. And this documentary is about Together for Yes, the campaign. So it doesn't tell the story of every group that did hugely significant work on the topic. There are many groups that are not represented in the documentary, or who are only briefly represented in there. And that's complicated, when you're trying to make a film about one group. But knowing, politically and diplomatically, that there's so many other people that are involved in this story, and trying to weave your way through that. We would have had that same complexity when we did the story of Yes. It was simpler in that one because what we did was we went for the personal stories, and that allowed us that freedom to, really look at it from the personal point of view. And then groups such as Belong To or Marriage Equality, popped in and out maybe in archive footage. But with the Together for Yes film, it was very much a campaign film. So the people who are telling the story are largely from HQ in Dublin. And of course, it was a huge grassroots movement that had groups all over the country. And there's no footage of that. And really, like, when you're looking at kind of history and the telling of a story, in a film, it largely becomes about those where there's footage of them. And we did really try to make an effort to include as many people as we could. And, so you'll see little bits of footage of groups here and there. But ultimately, it's quite complicated trying to represent groups that maybe did a huge amount of work, but there's very little ephemeral evidence of that in terms of photographs or video footage.
Yeah.
So that's a hard part, I suppose, because we would have loved to represent some of the amazing things that happened around the country, but there was just nothing there to show it.
Once you're in on marriage equality, it's joyous, and it's joyous across the board. But with abortion rights, it's just complicated. It's not this clean, oh, this person has an amazing life, they're in love and they're happy. It's more like mitigating sadness and tragedy for people in a lot of ways, and dealing with hardship, which isn't as clean a self, if that makes sense, as clean a story.
It's a difficult topic for a lot of people, and so it wasn't the same kind of story as marriage equality, which was about love and equality, and it was a very positive story, and people wanted to be part of it. And I found that very much when we went to make When Women Won. Some people didn't want to tell their story again. It was very emotional and very difficult for women to tell their story. Women telling their stories was a huge part of the campaign, and had been a very important thing even before Together for Yes started. People like Tara Flynn or Roisin Ingle were very brave and came out quite early and told their stories. And there was a lot of women who told very, very painful and difficult stories to do with termination for medical reasons. And, having to go over it again for a documentary is in a way kind of re-traumatizing. And a lot of people felt very hurt and I use the word trauma because people would have used that word when they talked to me about it. They didn't want to necessarily have to go through that again. And I suppose our film was very careful and very carefully considered in terms of how we handled the personal stories, that we didn't really go down the route of telling them again in detail.
Yeah.
The film itself is quite enjoyable to watch, and
Yeah.
it's uplifting, which is a difficult thing to do because the topic is so sad and difficult, so you're trying to strike a balance there of, people are celebrating at the end, and it's celebratory and it's important, and you're trying to communicate why this is important. It isn't about the fact that people have difficult situations in their lives and they have to make that decision. It's more about having that choice, and I suppose about women's empowerment and women's freedom.
And women's place in the country as well.
Yeah, women's place in Irish society, absolutely. And
up to this point, everything that happened historically and up till very, very, very recent memory. And I would say as well, like, it's not totally in the clear, because the cervical check issue that has come up, like that scandal has kind of proven we're not in the clear, like things aren't clean sailing.
Yeah, and that actually happened. That happened during the campaign, and the topics became enmeshed in that way, and Vicky Phelan then came out, because you had a health minister who was backing the Together for Yes campaign, but then obviously, some faith was lost in him because of that scandal, and it could have gone either way for them. It could have really been, a negative. But actually, I think thankful to Vicky Phelan for coming forward and backing the campaign, that really helped to swing it the other way for them. So it became part of the issue, because it was bound up in lots of different things that had happened, obviously the story of the Magdalene laundries and everything that had happened with the Catholic Church. Yeah, all of those things would have fed into it, So we briefly do go into the history of it. It's a huge chapter, so many things happened over those 35 years, and we couldn't go into it all in detail in the film, but we alluded to it. But the archive is incredible, and fair dues to RTÉ that they do have a wonderful archive in there, and I spent a week in there looking at. There's such amazing footage about women's lives in particular. And when you watch it now, like with all the knowledge that we have, some of it's so shocking in a way. And the way that, it's always the way when you look back at footage, the way that people speak and the kind of things that people say that were acceptable at the time. So shocking when you look back at it with today's lens, But yeah, there was a wonderful archive there, and we couldn't include it all. And when you look back actually in particular at the report on Anne Lovett and what happened at the time, it's really quite extraordinary broadcasting and really brave, and the kind of things that they said at the time would surprise you actually, that it was, because we when we think back about that time, we think that there weren't voices there that were dissenting, or that there weren't people there standing up and speaking their mind, but there were actually, so there's a really beautiful report in RTÉ on the Anne Lovett story that's really very powerful, which we couldn't include because it's a very long piece, but it does show you that there was a lot of work done over the years, And obviously, Kitty Holland's mother was one of the very first people to come out and tell her story at a time when it was incredibly difficult. And she would have experienced a terrible backlash for doing that. So there were people who did stand up, and there were people who campaigned for a very long time. And of course, Alva Smith was one of those people who was there from the very, very early days. So it's wonderful to get to film with her and to tell some of her story. And the fact that she had that memory of the historical piece was really helpful, because the younger generation that we interviewed had brilliant stories to tell about the now and about what was happening in social media and what happened around the Savita story. But really to have those voices like Sinead Kennedy and Alva Smith to talk about the past and to bring us back there, it set the scene, and I think gave a great context to everything.
And it is, and it's all out of that context. And I remember when the verdict came through, I didn't believe it. Do you know, on the exit poll? And I was like, no. And it was really funny. It took like three people, and they were like, yeah, but it wasn't like 53%. It was like 60.
It was such a huge, it was such a huge a huge percentage that you know really you knew that it was across the line, but at the same time it's hard to believe, because I do remember that the night before thinking, you know, this isn't going to happen. And I think everyone felt very nervous about it because it's so hard to know how these things are going to go. And you just wonder, has Ireland changed that much? And of course, I suppose we saw what happened in marriage equality. So there was a sense that it could go the same way, but at the same time, it's such a different topic. It's a very difficult topic for some people, so you just didn't know. And in the documentary, that was quite a difficult thing to represent. You know, the fact that we had lots of archival footage from RTE and from the Irish Times and News Talk and different sources to look through and see, okay, you know, we can build a story here about the day of the results. But of course, the results came in the night before, so that was a bit of a challenge in trying to tell that part of the story. And we talked about, you know, will we just not go into the exit polls too much and just make it about the day? But actually, no. I mean, we had to stick with that moment. That's when they all found out. They were all just watching the Late Late Show, and the exit polls came in during the Late Late Show. So we got that footage and we interviewed everyone about it. And then we just tried to capture that atmosphere. And so we went out and filmed the street on Mount Street where they had their offices at night and just tried to build the tension. I know they had a pile of yes speeches and a pile of no speeches. You know, everyone was, you know, out campaigning until the very last minute. So we had some kind of dusky shots of Dublin and, you know, trying to bring people back there to that moment. And they all told that story so well.
Yeah.
And they were so relieved when the yes exit poll came in. Yeah, so you kind of, over the film, you get to know them all a little bit, you know, and you get a sense of why it matters to each of them. So when you see their reaction to the yes coming in, it's very satisfying. Yeah, it's great.
It is. No, it is. It's lovely to relive those moments again, just to kind of sit down and to take a moment to kind of breathe it in and be like, no matter how shitty things go at the moment, no matter what's happening across the world, like these were these two moments in history that, you know, people really turned up and went, and our country really showed up.
Yeah, it does make you very proud. Yeah.
I think before the two referendums, especially, I just really had kind of lost all faith. You go like, this is the way that people treat women up until so recently. In 1996 was the last Magdalen laundries that were closed, and this is what's still here in our society.
It's a very difficult history, and I suppose you can see what it meant to people when you look back at footage and interviews with women, just ordinary women who had come down to Dublin Castle that day and, you know, were in tears being interviewed by RTE or being interviewed by one of the international broadcasters that showed up on the day. They didn't say why and they didn't tell their stories, but you knew that this was very personal to them or to their mother or to a sister or a friend, and that, you know, so many people had an experience. And that's why we kind of lingered on some faces in the crowd, and you just kind of wonder, you know, why is that person there, and, you know, why does it matter to them, and why is it important to them? And, you know, you don't need to know, because as women we all know, and we've all known for so long how important this was and why it's important. And I think that was the thing when they went around knocking on doors. Obviously people had questions and they had concerns and they had doubts in their mind, and their minds needed to be put at ease about it, because they had those areas that they were worried about, whether they were worried about the 12 weeks or whatever it was that they wanted to ask questions about. But ultimately, people knew people that had been through this, you know. So even in small towns in Ireland, like, I think people can underestimate rural Ireland and think, you know, rural Ireland is backwards, and that isn't the case at all. And you can see that when you look at the tallies for the different counties. You know, people knew people who had been through this, and they were wise to what was going on, and they knew and understood the context of this, that it wasn't just about abortion, that it was about women's liberation, and it was about how we treat women in Irish society and what had gone on over the years, and, you know, the church control over women's bodies. So I think there was just a huge relief, and people just felt so like this had finally happened, you know, the day had finally come.
And I think another thing that you guys tackled very well in this is men showing up for it. and going, you know, like maybe initially going, it's not really my area, and then the stories coming out, and then that support.
Yeah, it's quite a funny moment in the documentary actually, because Linda Kavanagh is totally hilarious, and she does a great interview, and she says a line in it where she says, "Men like to tell you their opinion about everything else, but why not this?" So I think the campaign became aware that, you know, men were opting out, and you know, it was very important because the documentary was trying to capture the campaign for Together for Yes as a record of what had happened. It was very important that we had certain topics that we went through and covered, and the opt-out man was one of those. And there was some wonderful footage because some great campaign videos had been made around that topic, and lots of men had come out and lent their voice to it, and there was various hashtag campaigns and things like that. So yeah, it obviously was hugely important that men went out and voted, and so that was a nice opportunity for a bit of humor as well. Like humor is so important in these kind of topics, you know, like you're tackling something that's so complex and so emotional, but then you have to have a little bit of light in there too. So Linda was great for that, and there was a fair few funny little moments in it. Like, you know, when you're looking back at archive footage, like some of the footage maybe wouldn't have been amazing quality sometimes, but it might be very funny because there's a false start, if somebody's recording and they didn't realize they're recording and things like that, or maybe somebody was filming something on their phone, you know, that wasn't necessarily intended to be held up there, you know, but it captures the humor and the camaraderie and the energy of the time. So we really like mined the hard drive for those moments. The campaign did have lots of volunteers that went and filmed things, which was brilliant, and we would have looked through that. But you're not looking through it for the perfect, wonderful, you know, footage that's really well shot or anything. You're actually looking for those little human moments that reveal something about the personalities, and you know, how did they go through those days in there, you know, stuck in HQ for months on end, and the stress of it all, you know.
I think that that particular referendum as well, because it was so divisive, and someone that you think would be on your side isn't, and it's very surprising. And you're questioning, where did those beliefs come from?
I know, and like I would have friends who voted no, and I have, you know, people in my life, you know, and relatives who would have voted no.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it's important always to be respectful of the fact that people have different opinions, and be interested in why they have those opinions, and be willing to listen to people. It's very important that people are, I suppose, given an opportunity to voice those concerns and ask those questions and to voice those opinions, you know. And I suppose that's maybe a thing about this documentary, that it isn't balanced in that way. I mean, if I was directing this for RTE, we probably would have had to take a very different approach. And you know, it's the same with the story of Yes. There was, you know, very little time given to the no side on marriage equality. I was rewatching it there the other day, and you know, I still get quite annoyed at some of the things that are said in the debates. You know, when you show the debate footage in these documentaries, you can find yourself getting quite riled up again at some of the things that are said, and be incredulous that somebody could say such a thing and believe such a thing, and how, what a short time ago that was, and was, you know, not, it wasn't acceptable, but acceptable enough to broadcast it. It just seems so surprising. But at the end of the day, you know, that's part of the process and part of democracy, and giving, I suppose, a voice to both sides, and then people voting and making their decision. But this documentary won't be broadcast on RTE, which is kind of interesting, I think. You know, I mean, the story of Yes is essentially the same documentary. It's very, very similar, and was commissioned by RTE. But When Women Won isn't going to be broadcast because RTE felt that the topic is still very divisive.
Too divisive for public funding.
And, you know, it is funded by Together for Yes. So, you know, in that way, you know, the origin of it is maybe problematic for RTE. But it is interesting too, though, that there hasn't been a documentary broadcast about it, and it's a huge historical moment. It's a really big moment in our social history, and the anniversary is
that
coming up
it was
now, and
such a landslide.
it was such a
Yes,
landslide. So
it
it's
was
a huge
such a
majority.
landslide. Like it wasn't even close. Like it was just absolutely the majority of people were like, this is what we're voting in now.
Yeah,
Which is funny that it's still not celebrated in that same way. But I
yeah.
suppose again it is just a divisive topic, and it may be as well it's tough for people to hear.
Yeah, I'm not, I haven't discussed it in depth, I suppose, but, as you say, like it's a 67% landslide vote. And therefore, I think it should be broadcast. I think that there should be a
Yeah.
record of it, you know, put out there, to acknowledge what happened and how it happened from the campaign point of view. There'd be nothing stopping the No Side making a similar documentary.
And they'd
Um,
have a lot of money to do
yeah, they probably would have the
it.
funding to
So
do it, but it's important, I suppose, that these stories are told. So I'm glad that Together Yes did put some money aside to make a record of it, because obviously they've written a book as well, and that's there now, I suppose, to capture the campaign story. Obviously there are so many other stories, and there are other groups that did huge things. I saw Amnesty International made a brilliant short documentary that went up on YouTube as well last year, and it's great to have a record of the work that was done, and it is useful for other countries who are looking at Ireland and wondering, well, how did they achieve it, and how might we learn from that.
And what would be maybe some techniques that you would use style-wise in creating the narrative around those events?
Because we didn't have footage for lots of the emotional moments in the story, we kind of recreated, I suppose, the moment in a way. We did what we did on the Story of Yes, a very similar thing that Hugh Rogers would have done on the Story of Yes, and we did it again on When Women Won, where it was like an echo, I suppose, of the moment. And it was very funny because it was quite hard to convince the Together for Yes team to do this, because they were very, I suppose, authentic and pure to the truth, and they felt a bit like, oh, this is really strange, like it's a year later, like I wasn't in this room, I wasn't wearing these clothes, or and it took a bit of convincing, because I think
I
cinema.
didn't realize that when I
Yeah.
was watching it. So
Well,
that's how good it was.
and lots of people have said that to me. So
I
like the
didn't
thing is, we
realize.
weren't there, we didn't film any of those things, we weren't following the campaign, we didn't have cameras rolling on the day of the results or anything like that. And those moments, like that moment in the HQ when they all saw the debate, for example, on Claire Byrne, sure, there's never any cameras there for that kind of moment. So the footage of the
And
debate.
you'd want to think not, because it's probably you in your pajamas eating popcorn and throwing it at the television
Yeah,
and
like, so
shouting
you
like a
don't want
lunatic.
that on television. So
No.
like, you kind of, I suppose, try to find in documentary a way of like naturally representing that, so it doesn't feel like a really hammy kind of dramatic recreation, but feels like a very natural reflection on that moment. So we try and just get people to go back and just look at it again, but in a more kind of heightened setting. So like, with Sarah Monaghan, we would have put her into a boardroom in a Georgian building and had her watch the debate. So it just worked really well, because, she's talking about it very authentically in her interview, but you've nothing to kind of, represent that moment. So, and we would have done it in the Story of Yes as well, where Michael Barron talked about driving around Dublin with like rainbow flags out this van while he was campaigning, and a year later we made poor Michael get into Hugh put him into the back of the van with a few
I didn't realize that was a recreation
yeah,
either. That
so
makes it quite funny, because it's a brilliant fan.
yeah, and it's funny, like, I suppose in a way maybe we shouldn't reveal that these moments aren't real, because when you're watching it, you just,
It's good to know this is for filmmakers
yeah, this is
anyway. So
filmmaking,
yeah.
and it does make a difference, and it is the difference between something being a bit more cinematic or emotional and something being a bit of a flat narrative, where it's just interview archive, and there's nothing really that lifts it, I suppose, to another level. And so we love to do that because it's fun. They're fun to shoot when you can get the participants to get on board with it, because not everyone wants to do it. And really, like, you know, trying to get poor Alva Smith to like put on her pink leather jacket again and pretend she's going out to vote, you know, they can feel a bit silly. And then people start to doubt you a little bit and think, oh God, this is going to be really awkward. And so it can make people feel a bit nervous for sure, but they've got to trust you. And I suppose that, you know, we very much would just remind them, look, if you're not happy with it, we'll take it out. But I think you will be happy with it when you see it. And we've done it before and it works really well. And just making people relax into it, because they're not actors, they're not performers. So you're not asking somebody to act or pretend something's real, but you're just asking them to go back there. So we would have got Linda Kavanagh and Sarah Clarkin to sit and read the comments on the fundraising campaign page again, which is the moment she spoke about, and they're really reading them.
Yeah, and so that wasn't real.
That's
She's
not
actually
real.
crying.
I'm sorry.
So.
Well, it is. I suppose what's real, like, you know, it is real in that they are
I feel so
being
cheated.
genuine. I'm sorry. I love documentaries that do play with the boundaries of reality. So like The Arbor, or The Imposter is another one that did it. But there's lots of documentaries that, you know, recreate things, but in a way that's still very real. And so, you know, it is real. They are the people who genuinely were there in that moment, and they are reading genuine comments that were on the page, and they are reacting to them in the moment in a way that is true.
Yeah.
But it just isn't the very same moment that they were speaking about in the interview.
Okay.
So I suppose that, you know, when you get swept up in the story, you don't notice it, and you're and that's the best way. You shouldn't be analysing it. And even though I'm a filmmaker, I watch 99% of television that way and films that way. So I'm not analysing them. But when I'm watching them for work, I watch them with a very different eye.
But tell me a little bit about where can people see When Women Won?
So When Women Won had its premiere at the Virgin Dublin International Film Festival. We had a lovely screening there with big audience and very celebratory. And it was then to be showing in the Boston Irish International Film Festival, and it had won an award there in advance, Special Jury Prize Award. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit, and so everything has been placed on pause at the moment. So we are planning other screenings, but we haven't any firm, I suppose, news on where it's going to show next. So we will,
of course,
watch this space, I suppose. You know, it's very hard to plan. Yeah, it's very hard to organize screenings.
Do you have a Facebook page that maybe people can track it if they're interested in following the progress, or a website?
Yeah, so our website is invisiblethreadfilms.com, and you can get news there. And we also have a Facebook page, Invisible Thread Films, and we are on Twitter as well. So yeah, we'll post kind of, you know, updates as soon as we have them. But for a lot of filmmakers, you know, it's about reimagining how can we do screenings. You know, can we do screenings online? Some festivals have gone online. So ultimately this film will be online. That was always the intention, that it would be shared online and that people could view it. So it wasn't made as like a commercial enterprise, and you know, it was very much made to tell the story and to get it out to people. So so hopefully we'll be able to share it soon.
Of course. So what we will do is make sure that there's links to the website and any social media pages in the description of this podcast. And now on to something that was also very joyous and fun, the Creative Kids documentary that you guys were putting together for, it was RTE, was it?
Yeah, so Creative Kids is a new documentary that we filmed, myself and producer Aoife Kavanagh with Frontline Films, and it's funded by Creative Ireland and RTE, and it's going to be broadcasting on Sunday, May 3rd at 6:30 p.m. And the documentary, it is very joyous and very uplifting, and I think it's a wonderful watch for people who are stuck at home at the moment. It's about the Creative Schools project, which was rolled out across a number of schools over the past year, where visiting artists would come to schools and do workshops in the arts, everything from singing, dancing, bakery, t-shirt printing, music, dance. They did so many projects across the country, and we follow a number of those. We are in the presentation school in Tralee, County Kerry, where they're putting on a show in Sheemsa Tira, and follow a number of children down there who are just so engaging and so adorable. And the theme of their show is about breaking down boundaries. So we have two children who we really focus on there, Kira and Mehek. And Mehek is Muslim, and Kira is from Tralee, and they have a lovely friendship, and they sing and rehearse together, and it's just really sweet.
They're back and
They're
forth.
very
It's
funny.
really cute.
They're very, very funny.
Yeah.
So
Little characters.
They're such little characters, yeah. So we're also in a secondary school, the Educate Together in Stepaside, which is a new school. So they only have first to third year. And I really drank the Kool-Aid there. I wanted to go back to school. I just really enjoyed my time there. They'd a really wonderful relationship with the students, the teachers. And the students are all, it's the Educate Together ethos on first name basis. But I think because it's a new school as well, there's a real kind of, I suppose, special energy around the place, and it really feels like they're building the school from the ground up, and there's a real partnership between the young people, and they really listen to them. So they put on a festival, and so it's following that process. But they also have a visiting poet come in, John W. Sexton, who's just such a character. He's like a rock and roll, punk rock poet who comes in and really engages the young people, especially those young people who are at the back of the class and not really listening. And one of the kids we interview says he absolutely hates school, but you see that he gets really into the class. And we are in a Desh school in the inner city in Dublin 8, where I live, in Warrenmount, where they do a bakery workshop with a local businesswoman who runs the Dublin Cookie Company. So there's so many different types of projects that they do. We're on the islands as well. We're on Aaron Moore, where some artists go out to work with the young people there, and also with a wonderful choreographer and dance teacher in Castlebar in County Mayo. So there's real variety of the experiences, but ultimately the children's voices and their stories and experiences, they're just fantastic. So they really light up things at the moment for people who are at home and looking for something fun to watch.
Oh, it's so lovely. There's two kids, and again, I think at the moment when there's such a focus on, getting your academia stuff done, where not everyone's brains work like that. Not everyone's brains are designed to sit down and process maths all day, or to, regurgitate random facts.
Totally. And engagement with the arts really does, it's been shown and proven to help people with their academia. So while some parents and some teachers might feel this is just putting on a show, or all these dance classes, or all this music, or whatever, is a distraction from the curriculum, actually it has been shown that taking part in the arts helps improve English, maths, all those other academic subjects. And it's been proven to help with school retainment as well. Like, it makes children want to be in school, to want to show up and to participate. So there's loads of benefits. And as you say, not everyone's academic. School shouldn't all be stressful and about exams. It's about learning to work in a team, and to express yourself, to be able to speak in public, and to have confidence and all that.
And developing different skills. And again, it's only one type of intelligence that is rewarded when there's such beautiful moments. There's one, and it's this girl is baking cookies, and she's so proud, and she's done something really fun and creative.
It's very genuine, Denise. I remember that moment, and she said, this has been the best experience of my life. And she really did mean that, because I know the principal said it to us afterwards, because she'd done an interview with us as well, and she just loved the whole day and the whole experience. And how amazing is that? How wonderful is that? That her taking part in that workshop that day was something that like she is going to always remember. And that's just really special. And I think there's lots of lovely little moments like that in it where, you know, you can see that the children have really learned something that they've never learned before, and they're experiencing something really special and really powerful. And I think for the teaching staff as well, like you can see, and we really included those lovely shots where you could see that the teacher was enjoying it just as much as the kids, and the big smiles on their faces, you know. So, you know, it's just so uplifting, and I loved working on it.
So was it the same team who did When Women Won, and that filmed the story of Yes?
So it's funny, I suppose it's the same team, but in different roles. On the story of Yes, Hugh Rodgers, who is also my brother, directed, and I produced, and Savita Halappanavar produced. And then when it came to When Women Won, I directed it, and Hugh was the producer and composed all the music. And again, Savita Halappanavar was the producer again. So we take turns. It was co-directed. It's important actually to mention the team, because documentaries,
of course,
I think more so than anything, are such collaborative enterprises, you know. So Gary Keane was the co-director on it, so he directed some of those scenes in Mayo and in on Aaron Moore. And it was edited by a wonderful editor, Isilde Howlett, who helped bring together so much footage and weave that narrative between 5 different schools, which is a huge amount of footage. And Eve Cavanagh's just a brilliant producer. So, you know, we had a lot of fun making it. Eleanor Bowman did a lot of the filming, and Matt Curran, Michael O'Donovan. So the 3 of them are just superb cinematographers. But there's always such a big team in documentary working together to tell the story, you know.
And Creative Kids is such a nice watch. One of the kids, when he's chatting with that rock star poet guy, he was saying, and he's like, and it's really funny, and it's also kind of very sad in a way, where he was like, I didn't really realize this was sort of an option, or that this type of thing was out there.
Yeah,
you know, where like those kind of creative outlets where, you know, and I think maybe as a society, especially now, we're on the, like, we lost definitely after 2008 when austerity took hold. Like, the creative arts weren't given maybe the focus that it should. And I hope now that we're on the precipice of something else, maybe where things are going to regress a little financially, that the healing power and the importance of the nurturing element of things that are creative for people's spirits and souls and moods will be focused on.
Yeah, it's very worrying in terms of, it's very, very worrying for the arts, what's happening, you know, and of course the arts take a huge hit when there's a recession, you know, because they aren't seen as essential. And anyway, in the best of times, when we have a thriving economy, artists are expected to live on such incredibly low incomes, you know. Like I remember reading at some point, like, you know, how much dancers make in a year, and like it was well below minimum wage, you know. It is very worrying, you know. So like it's so important to fund the arts, and when you see these artists, you know, at work, it's a brilliant project Creative Ireland, you know, have done there in the creative schools, and I hope it continues, because getting to expose children to different ways of thinking, and, you know, getting them to work with their hands and be involved in a project like that, you know, I think it's a great celebration. Yeah, it's a great celebration of what they can do. It's also a way of paying artists to do what they do, but maybe in a different kind of context. So, you know, all of us have to find ways to subsidize what we do with other work to help make a living wage, you know, so that you are surviving and able to, you know, do ordinary things like, you know, get a mortgage.
Yeah.
So you know, it's a brilliant project. So hopefully, that was a pilot project as far as I understand, and so hopefully it will continue, you know, no matter what happens now with our economy.
Brilliant. So May the 3rd on RTE, keep an eye out for that, and I presume it'll be on the player afterwards as well.
It will, yeah.
So definitely, it's a really enjoyable one.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you so much.